30 days later, the auditorium fell silent as Captain Thalia Mercer stood behind the podium, her hands trembling against the polished wood. 200 senior Marines filled the seats before her, colonels with decades of command, sergeant majors whose chests bore the weight of wars she'd only read about in history books. The overhead lights felt like interrogation lamps, exposing every bead of sweat forming along her hairline. In the front row, Sergeant Major Knox Ashford sat with his arms crossed, his weathered face unreadable. Those ice blue eyes that had witnessed 36 years of combat, of brotherhood, of loss, they were fixed on her now with the same intensity he'd probably used to acquire targets through a scope at 2,000 meters. Thalia's throat went dry. Her prepared speech, memorized and rehearsed until 3 in the morning, suddenly felt like a foreign language on her tongue. The PowerPoint slide behind her glowed with a single phrase: dignity through excellence. 30 days ago, she'd stood in a very different kind of spotlight, not the clean, fluorescent glow of a military auditorium, but the harsh reality of complete professional catastrophe. 30 days ago, she'd made a choice that should have ended her career. Instead, it had brought her here. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat, straightened her shoulders the way her father had taught her before he died, protecting a man whose name no one remembered. "I'm Captain Thalia Mercer, and 30 days ago, I committed the worst mistake of my military career." The room seemed to hold its breath. This is the story of how that mistake saved me. The California sun hung low over Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, painting the Pacific horizon in shades of burnt orange and deep purple. Under different circumstances, Captain Thalia Mercer might have appreciated the beauty of it. The way the dying light caught the rolling hills of the base, turning the dusty training grounds into something almost poetic. The cool ocean breeze that carried the salt smell of the Pacific, cutting through the inland heat that had baked the ground all day. But Thalia Mercer wasn't admiring sunsets, she was running. Her boots pounded against the asphalt pathway between the training compound and the main base facilities, each step sending fresh jolts of pain through legs that had been pushed past their limit approximately 12 hours ago. Her ACU uniform, the universal camouflage pattern that every soldier wore, was dark with sweat despite the cooling evening air. Red clay from the North Carolina training course they'd replicated here clung to her boots, her pants, even somehow to the back of her neck. 18 hours, 18 straight hours of Hell Week training exercises, pushing SEAL candidates through scenarios designed to break them down to their component parts and rebuild them into something harder. 18 hours of shouting corrections, demonstrating techniques, catching mistakes before they became casualties. Thalia's stomach contracted with a hunger so intense it felt like something alive and angry coiled beneath her ribs. When had she last eaten? Breakfast was a blur, toast grabbed at 0430 while reviewing the day's training schedule, consumed while standing at her kitchen counter with her daughter still asleep upstairs. Lunch had been sacrificed when Private Morrison froze halfway down a rappelling wall, his legs shaking so badly the rope swayed like a pendulum. She'd spent 3 hours with Morrison, 3 hours talking him through his fear, adjusting his technique, staying long after the training schedule said she should move on. Because that's what you did. That's what her father would have done. You didn't leave a Marine behind, even if the enemy they were fighting was their own terror. The mess hall closed at 1900 hours. 1900. 7 p.m. for civilians who didn't measure their lives in military time. Thalia checked her watch. 1847. 13 minutes. The mess hall sat 300 yards ahead, a low-slung building that had probably been constructed during the Reagan administration and maintained just enough to avoid being condemned. Light spilled from its windows, and even from this distance, Thalia could smell it, whatever the cooks had prepared. She didn't care what it was. Mystery meatloaf would taste like a 5-star meal right now. Her pace increased from a jog to a run. Marines leaving the building gave her strange looks. A captain shouldn't be sprinting across base like a recruit late for formation. But Thalia was past caring about appearances. Her body was operating on a level beyond conscious thought now, driven by the primal human need for calories. She hit the double doors at 18:49 hours, 11 minutes to spare, and immediately understood that 11 minutes might as well be 11 seconds. The line stretched the full length of the serving area. At least 30 Marines stood between her and food, their desert tan boots shuffling forward with the urgency of people who knew they had time. Behind the serving counter, kitchen staff were already beginning the nightly ritual of breaking down the hot food stations. Steam trays were being covered. Ladles were being set aside for washing. "No," Thalia muttered under her breath. "No, no, no." She'd earned this meal, earned it through every grueling hour of the day, through every safety violation she'd documented to prevent training accidents, through every soldier she'd counseled, through the near miss when Specialist Rodriguez almost walked into a clearly marked danger zone and Thalia had to physically tackle him out of the way. The mess hall was organized chaos, the usual dinner rush multiplied by the fact that half the base seemed to have descended at once. Marines milled around everywhere. Some stood in line, shifting their weight from foot to foot. Others carried trays to tables, searching for empty seats. A few clustered near the condiment station, engaged in the kind of low-stakes debate that filled the spaces between training and sleep. Thalia began weaving through the crowd, her 5'3" frame making it easy to slip between groups. Her focus locked onto that serving line with the intensity she normally reserved for acquiring targets through a rifle scope. She could do this. 13 minutes. Just had to get to the front, load a tray, find a corner to eat in peace. That's when she saw him. Directly in her path stood a man with his back to her. Small by Marine standards, maybe 5'7", wearing civilian clothes that immediately marked him as out of place. Blue jeans that looked soft with age. A navy blue polo shirt that had probably been purchased from the base exchange. His posture was relaxed, almost contemplative, as he stood studying the menu board mounted above the serving line. The menu board that hadn't changed in 3 months. The menu board that every Marine on base had memorized by now. From Thalia's angle, she couldn't see any rank insignia because he wasn't wearing a uniform. His collar was just fabric, no pins or patches. His shoulders bore no identifying marks. In the tunnel vision of exhaustion and hunger, Thalia's brain made instant calculations, snapped judgments that would have been laughable if they hadn't been so catastrophic. Civilian contractor, her mind supplied. Or maybe a dependent, someone's spouse doing shopping at the commissary who'd wandered into the mess hall by mistake. Someone who didn't understand mess hall protocol, didn't understand that when you were standing in the flow of traffic, blocking the path, you moved. Someone who didn't matter. That thought, that terrible, revealing thought, flickered through Thalia's consciousness so quickly she barely registered it. But it was there. In the hierarchy of her exhausted mind's priorities, this person ranked below getting food, below making the closing time, below everything except perhaps tripping over her own boots. "Excuse me," Thalia said, her voice carrying more edge than she intended. The bass rumble of conversations around them swallowed her words completely. The man didn't move. Maybe he didn't hear her over the noise. Maybe he was lost in thought about which of the 3 nearly identical entree options to choose. Maybe he simply didn't process that someone was behind him. Thalia's patience, already worn to the thickness of rice paper by 18 hours of stress, snapped with an almost audible crack. "I said move it," she barked, and reached out to push his shoulder. Not gently, not the polite tap of someone trying to get attention. An actual push, forceful enough that the man stumbled sideways, his hands shooting out to catch himself against a nearby table. For a fraction of a second, Thalia saw his face in profile, older than she'd assumed, maybe late 50s, with sharp features and eyes the color of winter ice. Those eyes turned toward her just long enough for their gazes to lock. But Thalia was already past him, already barreling toward the serving line with single-minded determination. Her shoulder clipped someone else, a corporal who jerked out of the way with a startled expression. She didn't apologize. She had 7 minutes now. 7 minutes before they sealed the hot food containers and her last chance at a meal evaporated. Some people need to learn situational awareness, she muttered loudly enough that several nearby Marines definitely heard her. She didn't notice their faces going pale, didn't catch the way their eyes went wide, their conversations cutting off mid-sentence. What Thalia did notice, finally, was the silence. It spread through the mess hall like a shockwave after an explosion. Conversations that had been creating a constant low roar of background noise suddenly ceased. The clatter of trays and silverware that formed the percussion section of the mess hall symphony seemed to diminish, as if the very utensils were shocked into stillness. Even the kitchen staff had frozen in place, a sergeant holding a serving spoon suspended in midair like a conductor whose orchestra had just committed a catastrophic error. Thalia looked around, confused by the sudden atmospheric change. It felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen from the room and replaced it with something heavier, oppressive, like the air before a lightning strike. Her buddy, Corporal Finnegan Blake, who she'd known since they'd served together in Syria, stood near a table about 15 feet away. His tray was forgotten in his hands. His face had drained of color so completely he looked like he might actually be sick. Like someone had just told him his entire family had died in a car accident. His mouth hung slightly open, and his eyes were fixed on something behind Thalia, with an expression that went beyond horror into something approaching existential dread. Next to Blake, Specialist Quinn had actually dropped his fork. It hit his tray with a clatter that seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed space, the sound echoing off the walls like a gunshot. "What?" Thalia asked, genuinely bewildered by their reactions. Her voice sounded too loud, too harsh in the new quiet. "What's everyone's problem?" Blake couldn't form words. His jaw worked like a fish drowning in air, trying to shape syllables that wouldn't come. He just stared past Thalia toward where the man was now walking with measured, unhurried steps toward a corner table that sat empty, while every other surface in the mess hall was packed with Marines. As the man moved, Thalia noticed something that made her stomach drop for reasons that had nothing to do with hunger. Marines were getting out of his way. Not obviously, not in panic, but with subtle, almost unconscious movements that created a clear path wherever he walked. Like water parting around a stone. A young lieutenant at a nearby table had gone rigid, his posture shifting into something resembling attention, even though the man wasn't looking in his direction. A captain Thalia recognized from battalion headquarters looked like he just swallowed something poisonous, his face a mask of barely controlled anxiety. "Finn," Thalia said, using Blake's nickname, trying to inject some normalcy into the surreal moment. Please tell me you didn't just what?" Thalia interrupted, her own voice sounding hollow even to her ears. "What's everyone's problem? Who is that guy?" Before Blake could answer, before he could form the words that would make Thalia's world collapse, a presence materialized at her shoulder. Not announced by footsteps or voice, just suddenly there with the inevitability of a shadow at noon. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Holloway stood beside her, a man Thalia had always respected for his calm professionalism and his ability to run the mess hall like a military operation. Right now, his face was completely unreadable. His jaw was tight enough that tendons stood out in his neck. His eyes, normally warm with the kind of humor that made even the worst duty stations bearable, were hard as flint. "Captain Mercer," Holloway said quietly, his voice carefully controlled in a way that suggested he was using every ounce of his considerable self-discipline. "I need you to finish getting your meal. Eat it quickly, then report immediately to Colonel Hargrove's office. He's waiting for you." The tone left absolutely no room for questions or discussion. This wasn't a suggestion. This wasn't a request. This was an order, delivered with the weight of someone who knew exactly how bad the situation was and had no desire to make it worse by explaining it in the middle of a crowded mess hall. Thalia's appetite vanished instantly, replaced by a cold knot of dread that settled in her stomach like a stone. The kind of dread that came before terrible news, before life-altering moments, before the axis of your world tilted and dumped you into freefall. "Gunny," she started. "What?" "Captain." Holloway's voice dropped even lower, and for just a moment, his professional mask cracked enough to show something that might have been sympathy. "Thalia, you're going to want to prepare yourself for that conversation." He walked away before she could respond, his shoulders set in a way that suggested he wanted to be anywhere else, having any other conversation. Thalia turned slowly, her eyes drawn back to the man she'd pushed. He sat alone at his corner table, calmly eating his meal as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't just been physically shoved by a captain who was now facing what felt like her own execution. Every other table in the mess hall was crowded with Marines sitting shoulder to shoulder, but his table had a clear perimeter around it, like there was an invisible force field, a zone of respect or fear, or something Thalia couldn't quite name. The man took a bite of his meatloaf, chewing thoughtfully, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, his ice-blue eyes flicked up and met Thalia's across the crowded room. He didn't look angry. He didn't look upset. He didn't look like someone who'd just been disrespected in front of 100 witnesses. He looked patient, like someone waiting for something inevitable to unfold, like someone who'd seen this movie before and already knew how it ended. Thalia's blood ran cold despite the warmth of the mess hall. A single thought crystallized in her mind with the clarity of a rifle scope finding its target. What had she just done? Her hands were shaking slightly as she moved through the serving line. The food that had seemed so appealing minutes ago now looked like sawdust on her plate. She mechanically accepted meatloaf, mashed potatoes, and green beans from kitchen staff who wouldn't meet her eyes. Even Sergeant Williams, who normally ran the serving line with cheerful banter that made even the worst meals bearable, remained completely silent. His face was carefully neutral, the expression of someone who just witnessed a car accident and didn't want to be called as a witness. Thalia carried her tray to the table where Blake sat, but her friend looked like he wanted to be anywhere else. As she approached, he actually flinched, sliding his chair back slightly, as if proximity to her might be contagious. As if whatever catastrophe she just unleashed might spread through physical contact. "Talk to me," Thalia said quietly, setting down her tray with hands that couldn't quite stay steady. Her appetite was completely gone now, but she forced herself to pick up her fork. The physical motion of eating might ground her, might make this feel less like the prelude to a professional execution. "What just happened?" Blake glanced around nervously, making sure no one was within earshot. The tables nearest to them had mysteriously emptied, Marines finding excuses to sit elsewhere, to get distance from ground zero before the explosion. "Thalia," Blake breathed, running his hand over his close-cropped hair in a gesture of pure stress. "You really didn't see his insignia?" "There was no insignia," Thalia insisted, her voice sharper than she intended. "I looked. He was wearing civilian clothes, jeans and a polo shirt. I thought he was, I don't know, someone's spouse or a contractor or something. Just someone who didn't understand mess hall flow." "Oh, God," Blake whispered, his face somehow going even paler. "Oh, God, Thalia. He's not." Before Blake could finish, Specialist Angela Martinez appeared at their table. She was part of Thalia's own training platoon, a reliable Marine Thalia had known for 2 years. Her face was pale, and she looked at Thalia with something resembling pity. The kind of pity people reserve for the condemned. "Captain Mercer," Martinez said softly, her voice barely audible over the resumed conversations around them. Conversations that seemed forced, artificial, as if people were trying too hard to pretend everything was normal. "People are saying, I heard from Corporal Jenkins, who heard from the lieutenant's aide, that the man you pushed was—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Was what?" Thalia demanded, her voice rising slightly. Several heads turned in their direction. "Will someone please just tell me who that man is?" Martinez leaned in closer, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They're saying he's Sergeant Major Knox Ashford." The fork slipped from Thalia's fingers and clattered against her plate, the sound seeming to echo through the mess hall like a death knell. "That's impossible," Thalia said, but her voice lacked conviction. "A sergeant major wouldn't be in here without anyone knowing. There'd be, I don't know, some kind of protocol. People would recognize him. He'd be in uniform." "Unless he didn't want anyone to know," interrupted a voice from behind her. Thalia turned to find Lieutenant William Foster standing there, a young officer who'd graduated from the Naval Academy just 2 years ago. Foster was normally confident to the point of cockiness, the kind of officer who walked like he owned whatever ground he stood on. Right now he looked shaken, his usual swagger completely absent. "Sir," Thalia stood up automatically, years of military protocol kicking in despite her confusion. Foster gestured for her to sit back down and pulled up a chair, his voice low enough that only their small group could hear. "I was over by the command building this afternoon. Saw a convoy arrive. Real low-key, no flags, no ceremony, nothing. Just 2 black SUVs with tinted windows. My CO got a call and practically sprinted out of the office like someone had lit his pants on fire." He paused, glancing toward where the man sat eating calmly, methodically working through his meal as if he had all the time in the world. About an hour later, there was an email. "Command staff only. Subject line, new assessment protocol. We were told that a senior NCO would be conducting an unannounced culture evaluation. We were ordered to act normal, not to alert anyone, not to treat anything differently." Foster's eyes were sympathetic in a way that made Thalia's stomach twist. "Captain, I think you just put your hands on Sergeant Major Knox Ashford, the Silent Guardian." The name hit Thalia like a physical blow, like someone had just punched her in the solar plexus and driven all the air from her lungs. Everyone in the Marine Corps knew that name, knew the legend. Sergeant Major Knox Ashford was Marine Corps royalty, the kind of figure whose career became the stuff of whispered stories in barracks around the world. A Marine who'd enlisted at 18 and climbed to the highest enlisted rank through nothing but merit, grit, and more combat deployments than most people could count. Desert Storm, Somalia, Fallujah, Kandahar. 36 years of service spanning every major conflict since the first Gulf War. 3 Navy Crosses, 2 Silver Stars, a Purple Heart with oak leaf cluster, which meant he'd been wounded in combat multiple times and kept going back. The Silent Guardian. That's what Marines called him, though never to his face. The man who appeared where Marines were in trouble, who pulled off impossible rescues, who made shots that shouldn't have been possible, and saved lives that should have been lost, and then disappeared before anyone could thank him, before anyone could make a fuss. "No," Thalia said, but her voice was weak, unconvincing even to her own ears. "That can't be right. Why would a sergeant major be walking around in civilian clothes with no rank showing, no security detail, nothing?" "Because that's exactly what Sergeant Major Ashford does," said a new voice. Gunnery Sergeant Holloway had returned, standing at the head of their table with his arms crossed. His expression was grave in a way that made Thalia's chest tighten with something approaching panic. "I served under him in Fallujah, back when he was a master sergeant," Holloway continued. "He's famous for this. Shows up unannounced at bases, strips off his rank insignia, walks around observing how Marines really behave when they think no one important is watching." He looked directly at Thalia, and there was no anger in his expression, just a kind of weary disappointment that somehow felt worse. "He believes you can judge a unit's true character by how people treat those they think are beneath them, how they treat people they assume can't do anything for them or to them." The words landed like individual hammer blows, each one driving home a truth Thalia desperately wanted to deny, but couldn't. She'd pushed the man because she was tired, hungry, frustrated, And because she'd looked at him and seen someone who didn't matter, someone she could move aside without consequence, someone whose dignity was less important than her need to get to the front of the line 13 minutes before closing time. "I didn't know," Thalia said quietly, pushing her tray away. She couldn't even look at the food anymore. The smell that had been so appealing minutes ago now made her nauseous. "I swear I couldn't see any rank. I just thought—" "You thought he was someone who didn't matter," Holloway finished bluntly, his words cutting through her attempted explanation like a knife through tissue paper. "Someone you could push around, literally." The words stung because they were true, brutally, undeniably true. Talia had been exhausted, hungry, and frustrated, and she'd taken it out on someone she'd perceived as lower in the invisible hierarchy that governed every human interaction on a military base. The fact that he turned out to be a sergeant major made it catastrophically worse from a career perspective. But Holloway was right about the deeper problem. The real issue wasn't the mistaken identification. It was the attitude that made the mistake possible in the first place. "What do I do?" Thalia asked quietly, her voice barely audible. "You already have your orders," Holloway reminded her. "Finish eating and report to Colonel Hargrove. Whatever happens next is way above my pay grade." He softened slightly, his voice losing some of its edge and taking on the tone of someone who'd seen good Marines make bad choices before. "For what it's worth, Captain, you're a good officer. I've seen you lead your Marines well. You stayed 3 extra hours with Morrison today when you didn't have to. You've never asked your people to do anything you wouldn't do yourself. But this," he shook his head slowly, "this is bad, real bad." As Holloway walked away, Thalia forced herself to look across the mess hall at Sergeant Major Ashford. He was nearly finished with his meal now, eating at a leisurely pace that suggested he had nowhere to be and all the time in the world to get there. Occasionally, his eyes would sweep across the room with the methodical assessment of someone conducting surveillance, cataloging details that others missed. He seemed completely at ease, as if he hadn't just been physically shoved by a captain who was now contemplating the end of her career. A captain from the intelligence section walked past his table, and Thalia saw the man nod respectfully. The sergeant major nodded back but made no other acknowledgement, still maintaining his low profile despite what had happened. Blake finally found his voice again, though it came out rough and uncertain. "Thalia, my cousin served under Sergeant Major Ashford at Camp Lejeune 3 years ago. He told me stories. Ashford once court-martialed a lieutenant colonel for mistreating enlisted Marines, ended his career over it, made sure he was reduced in rank and forced into retirement." Blake looked at his friend with worried eyes that had seen too much in too short a time. "But he also personally mentored a corporal who'd screwed up badly, got drunk, caused a training accident that injured 2 Marines. Instead of throwing the book at him, Ashford spent 6 months helping him turn his career around. That corporal is a gunnery sergeant now, one of the best NCOs in his battalion." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a fired weapon. "The question is, which version of him are you going to meet in Colonel Hargrove's office?" Talia watched as the sergeant major stood up, collected his tray with the same precise movements he probably applied to everything, and walked to the dish return. Marines parted before him like the Red Sea before Moses, creating space without even seeming to consciously decide to do so. He disposed of his trash with methodical efficiency, then turned toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, he paused, turned his head slightly, looking directly at Thalia across the crowded mess hall. Their eyes met for the second time that evening, and Thalia felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. Those ice-blue eyes that had seen 3 decades of warfare, of leadership, of Marines at their best and worst. His expression was still impossible to read. Not angry, not amused, just observant, assessing. Like a sniper calculating wind speed and bullet drop before taking a shot that would either save lives or end them. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him with a quiet click that somehow seemed to echo through the still hushed mess hall, final as a coffin lid. Thalia looked down at her untouched food and realized her hands were shaking. In 12 years of military service, she'd faced enemy fire in 3 different countries. She'd survived mortar attacks, IED scares, and the kind of training exercises designed to push human beings past their breaking point. She jumped out of perfectly good aircraft and led Marines through some of the most dangerous terrain on Earth. But she'd never been more terrified than she was right now. "I need to go see Colonel Hargrove," she said quietly, standing up on legs that didn't feel entirely stable. Blake grabbed her arm, his grip tight with genuine concern. "Thalia, good luck. Whatever happens, you're a good Marine. Don't forget that." Thalia nodded numbly and headed for the door, feeling the eyes of every Marine in the mess hall watching her go. The walk to the command building felt like a march to her own execution. Her career, her family's future, everything she'd worked for over 12 years of service, it all hung in the balance now. And it all depended on what Sergeant Major Knox Ashford had decided about the captain who'd pushed him in the mess hall. The evening air had cooled considerably as Thalia stepped outside, the California night bringing the temperature down from the day's inland heat. A light breeze rustled through the palm trees that lined the pathway between buildings, carrying the salt smell of the Pacific Ocean just a few miles west. Under normal circumstances, Thalia would have found it pleasant, the kind of evening that made you remember why you endured the bureaucracy and the hardship of military life. Tonight, she barely noticed. Her mind raced through possibilities, each scenario worse than the last. The walk to the command building felt like the longest quarter mile of Thalia Mercer's life. Her boots struck the pavement with mechanical precision, each step carrying her closer to a reckoning she couldn't avoid and didn't fully understand. The pathway wound between buildings that had housed Marines for generations, their walls holding stories of careers made and broken, of decisions that altered the trajectory of lives. The command building loomed ahead, its windows glowing with fluorescent light against the darkening sky. Thalia had been here hundreds of times for routine meetings, briefings, administrative tasks that formed the skeletal structure of military life. It had never felt threatening before. Tonight it felt like walking into a courthouse for sentencing, knowing the verdict had already been decided by forces beyond her control. She climbed the concrete steps, their edges worn smooth by decades of boots, and pulled open the heavy door. The air conditioning hit her like a wall, raising goosebumps on sweat-dampened skin. The duty desk sat just inside the entrance, manned by a young corporal whose eyes widened with recognition as Thalia approached. "Captain Mercer," the corporal said carefully, his voice carrying the tone of someone who'd already heard rumors and didn't want to make things worse. "Colonel Hargrove is expecting you. He said to send you right in." "Thank you, Corporal," Thalia managed, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. She continued down the corridor, her boots echoing on polished linoleum that reflected the overhead lights like a dark mirror. The walls were lined with the accumulated history of Camp Pendleton, framed photographs of past commanding officers, unit citations, deployment photos from conflicts stretching back to World War II. Marines frozen in black and white, their faces young and determined, staring out at a future they couldn't imagine. Thalia stopped abruptly in front of the command structure display. A series of frames showed the chain of command, from the President down through the Secretary of Defense, the Commandant of the Marine Corps, and finally to the local leadership. In the bottom right corner, where the base's senior enlisted advisor's photo should be, was an empty space with a small placard that read, "Position pending, assessment phase." The previous sergeant major had retired 2 months ago. By tomorrow, that space would likely hold a picture of Knox Ashford, the man she'd shoved in the mess hall. The man whose ice-blue eyes had looked at her with that patient, assessing gaze that suggested he could see straight through to her soul and wasn't particularly impressed with what he found there. Thalia forced herself to keep walking. Colonel Hargrove's office was at the end of the hall, door slightly ajar. Through the gap, she could see her commanding officer sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen with an expression of deep stress. His jaw was tight, and even from this distance, Talia could see the tension in his shoulders. She knocked firmly on the doorframe, the sound seeming too loud in the quiet hallway. "Captain Mercer reporting as ordered, sir." "Come in, Talia. Close the door behind you." The use of her first name was not a good sign. Colonel Wesley Hargrove was usually strictly professional during duty hours, maintaining the kind of formal distance that made the rank structure function. When he used first names, it meant the situation had gone beyond normal protocols into territory that required a different kind of conversation. Thalia entered and shut the door with a quiet click that sounded like a cell door closing. She stood at attention, back straight, hands at her sides, maintaining military bearing even as her world threatened to collapse around her. Colonel Hargrove was 48 years old, a career infantry officer with 2 combat deployments and a reputation for being tough but fair. Thalia had served under him for 3 years and had always respected the man. He ran his command with clear expectations and consistent enforcement, the kind of leadership that made Marines feel secure even in uncertain circumstances. Right now, Hargrove looked like he'd aged 10 years in the past hour. Deep lines bracketed his mouth, and his eyes carried the weight of a conversation he clearly didn't want to have. "Sit down, Captain," Hargrove said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Talia sat, maintaining her rigid posture despite the chair's invitation to relax. Her hands rested on her knees, fingers pressed against the fabric of her uniform trousers. Hargrove was silent for a long moment, studying Talia with an expression that mixed disappointment with something that might have been pity. The clock on his wall ticked with mechanical precision, each second stretching into eternity. Finally, he spoke. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" "Sir, I pushed someone in the mess hall. I was told it might have been a senior NCO, but I couldn't see rank insignia because—" "Stop," Hargrove interrupted, holding up his hand. "Just stop. Let me show you something." He turned his computer monitor so Thalia could see the screen. A personnel file was open, displaying a military ID photo that made her stomach drop through the floor. The man from the mess hall stared back at her, but in this photo he wore his dress blue uniform. On each shoulder gleamed the insignia of his rank, Sergeant Major, E9, the highest enlisted rank in the Marine Corps. 3 chevrons up, 4 rockers down, with a star in the center. The kind of rank that represented decades of excellence, of leadership tested in the crucible of combat. "Sergeant Major Knox Ashford," Hargrove read from the screen, his voice flat as he recited facts that felt like accusations. 58 years old, enlisted at age 18 as a private, served continuously for 36 years across 9 combat deployments. He scrolled down and Thalia saw the list of assignments, of units, of wars. Desert Storm, 1991 with 2nd Marine Division. Somalia, 1993. 3 tours in Iraq between 2003 and 2008, including the Second Battle of Fallujah, where he earned his first Navy Cross, leading a counterattack that saved his entire platoon. Hargrove continued reading, each line adding weight to the catastrophic nature of Talia's mistake. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 2nd Navy Cross details still classified, but it involves something in the Korangal Valley that saved 23 Marines who should have died. 3rd Navy Cross from Syria, pulling wounded Marines from a building under active fire. He looked up from the screen, his eyes hard. Purple Heart with Oak Leaf Cluster, wounded in combat twice, refused evacuation both times until his Marines were safe. Combat Action Ribbon. Expert rifle and pistol qualifications maintained continuously for 36 years. Airborne qualified. Scout Sniper qualified with a career record of effectiveness that's still used as the benchmark for training. Hargrove scrolled further. He's commanded at every level from fire team to company. He's been the senior enlisted advisor at 3 different bases. He's trained over 800 Scout Snipers, including most of the instructors currently serving. He's testified before congressional committees on military readiness and combat effectiveness. The colonel leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. And last month, he was selected to serve as the senior enlisted advisor for this entire installation. 11,000 Marines, Captain. 11,000 Marines now under the oversight of the man you physically shoved in the mess hall because you were hungry and he was in your way. The weight of it crashed over Talia like a wave of cold seawater. This wasn't just any senior NCO. This was one of the Marine Corps' living legends. Someone who'd earned every single rank through merit and blood. Someone who'd literally bled for the Marines under his command. Someone whose name was spoken with reverence in scout sniper schools around the world. And she treated him like he was nothing, like he was an obstacle to be shoved aside. "Sir," Talia began, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know. That's not an excuse, I know, but I genuinely couldn't see his rank. The way he was standing, the civilian clothes, and I was exhausted from 18 hours of training, and You just assumed he was someone who didn't matter," Hargrove finished, his tone sharp enough to cut. "That's what your report to me will say, isn't it? That you were tired and hungry and saw someone you thought was lower in status, so you decided basic courtesy didn't apply." Talia wanted to argue, to defend herself, to explain that it wasn't like that, except it was exactly like that. She'd made an assumption based on perceived status and acted accordingly. The fact that her assumption was catastrophically wrong didn't change the fundamental truth of her attitude in that moment. "The sergeant major arrived 6 weeks ago," Hargrove continued, his voice taking on a lecturing quality. 6 weeks ahead of his official start date. No announcement, no ceremony, no advance notice to anyone below battalion command level. He specifically ordered us not to alert the base to his presence. Hargrove pulled up another document on his screen. He wanted to conduct what he calls a climate assessment. "Do you know what that means, Captain?" Thalia shook her head mutely. "He walks around in civilian clothes with his rank hidden, observing how Marines interact when they don't know someone important is watching. He evaluates everything, how NCOs treat privates, how officers treat enlisted personnel, how people behave in the mess hall, the motor pool, the barracks, the PX. He's looking for the real Camp Pendleton, not the sanitized version we'd show him on an official inspection." Hargrove leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. "Sergeant Major Ashford has a philosophy, Captain. He believes that the true character of a unit and of individual Marines is revealed in how they treat people who can't do anything for them. People they perceive as powerless or unimportant. People they think don't matter." Talia felt sick. By that standard, she'd revealed exactly who she was in that moment of exhaustion and hunger, and it wasn't a flattering picture. It didn't matter that she'd spent 3 hours helping Private Morrison overcome his fear. It didn't matter that she'd earned a Bronze Star in Afghanistan. In the moment that counted, when no one was watching, and she thought there would be no consequences, she'd shown her true character. And it was found wanting. "He's done this at every command he's taken," Hargrove said. "At Camp Lejeune, he caught a major berating a specialist for a minor uniform infraction, really laying into the kid, making him feel worthless. That major is now a civilian, retired at reduced rank. At 29 Palms, he observed a gunnery sergeant mentoring a struggling private with patience and genuine respect, spending his own off-duty time helping the Marine improve. That gunny got a commendation and a choice assignment to instructor duty. The implications were crystal clear. Sergeant Major Ashford was judge, jury, and executioner when it came to professional character, and Thalia had just failed his tests spectacularly. In front of a mess hall full of witnesses, with physical contact that could be construed as assault if he wanted to push the issue that far. "What happens now, sir?" Talia asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Hargrove turned the monitor back toward himself and closed the file with a decisive click. "Sergeant Major Ashford has requested that you report to his office tomorrow morning at 0530 hours. His temporary office is in Building 4, Room 203. He wants to speak with you personally. Did he say what about, sir? He didn't have to, Captain. Hargrove's expression softened slightly, showing the concern of a commander who genuinely cared about his Marines, even when they screwed up. Look, I've known you for 3 years. You're a good officer. You care about your Marines. You lead from the front. You've never had a single disciplinary issue cross my desk until today. He paused, shaking his head slowly. But this, I honestly don't know what he's going to do. Sergeant Major Ashford has a reputation for being absolutely fair, but he's also known for having zero tolerance for disrespect or abuse of authority. I've read about his career, studied his leadership philosophy. He's ended officers' careers for less than what you did today. Hargrove's voice took on a gentler tone. But he's also given second chances to Marines who show genuine remorse and potential for growth. The question is which category you fall into, and that's not for me to decide. That's entirely up to the Sergeant Major. What should I do, sir? My advice? Hargrove leaned back in his chair, his face showing the wear of too many hard conversations. Go in there tomorrow morning with absolute honesty. Don't make excuses. Don't try to minimize what you did. Own it completely. If there's one thing Sergeant Major Ashford respects, it's integrity. Marines who can look at their failures and acknowledge them without deflection. He paused, and his next words felt like a physical blow. And Captain, Thalia, prepare yourself for the possibility that your Marine Corps career might end tomorrow. I'm not saying it will, but you need to be ready for that outcome. Talk to your family tonight. Get your affairs in order. Hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. The words hit like individual rounds from a rifle, each one finding its mark. Career ending, tomorrow. After 12 years of service, of deployments, of sacrifices and successes, it could all end in a single conversation with a man she disrespected in the worst possible way. I understand, sir. Dismissed. And Thalia? Hargrove's voice softened further. For what it's worth, I hope he sees in you what I've seen. You're better than what you showed today. Make sure he knows that. Thalia stood, saluted with mechanical precision, and walked out of the office on legs that felt like rubber. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, the walls closer, the air thicker. The building felt like it was closing in around her, every surface a reminder of the institution she might be about to lose. Outside, the night had fully fallen. Stars were visible above Camp Pendleton, the same stars that had looked down on every Marine who'd ever worn the uniform. Thalia had looked up at these stars from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from Syria, from training fields across America. She might never see them as a Marine again. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A text from her mother, Helen, who was watching 8-year-old Ivy at home. How was your day? Ivy wants to say goodnight. Thalia stared at the message for a long moment, trying to figure out how to explain to her family that everything they'd built together might come crashing down tomorrow at 05:30 hours. How did you tell your daughter that mommy might not be a Marine anymore? How did you explain that a moment of thoughtlessness could undo 12 years of dedication? The drive home from Camp Pendleton to Thalia's house in the nearby military housing community normally took 15 minutes. Tonight, she sat in her truck in the parking lot for 20 minutes before she could even bring herself to start the engine. Her hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white, and she stared through the windshield at nothing, her mind replaying the moment in the mess hall over and over. If she could go back, change that one instant, everything would be different. But that was the thing about mistakes. You couldn't undo them. You could only try to learn from them and somehow, impossibly, be better. Finally, she started the truck and pulled out onto the main road. The familiar route passed in a blur. The commissary where her family shopped every Saturday, the elementary school Ivy attended, where parent-teacher conferences and school plays formed the mundane structure of normal life. The park where Thalia had taught her daughter to ride a bike, running alongside with one hand on the seat, until that magical moment when Ivy found her balance and pedaled away, free and laughing. Everything felt different now, tinged with the possibility of loss. Would they have to leave base housing if she was separated from the Marines? Would they have to move away from the only community Ivy had known since her father died in Afghanistan 5 years ago? She pulled into the driveway of their modest 3-bedroom house at 20:47 hours. Helen's car was already there, and lights glowed warm in the kitchen window. Through the glass, Thalia could see her mother moving around, probably cleaning up after dinner. Wednesday was usually spaghetti night. Ivy loved it, always got sauce on her face no matter how carefully she tried to eat. Normal life. A life that might be completely upended by tomorrow morning. Talia sat in the truck for another 5 minutes, trying to compose herself. She couldn't fall apart, not in front of Helen and Ivy. She needed to be strong, even if she felt like her world was collapsing. Even if every instinct screamed that she should curl up and hide from what was coming. The front door opened. Helen stood there, silhouetted against the warm light from inside, and even from the driveway, Thalia could see the concern on her 63-year-old face. 12 years of being a Marine's mother had given Helen an uncanny ability to read her daughter's moods from a distance, to sense when something was wrong before a word was spoken. Thalia had no choice. She turned off the truck and walked to the house, each step feeling like she was moving through deep water. "Thalia," Helen said as she reached the door. "What's wrong? You look terrible." "Is Ivy asleep?" "Just went down 10 minutes ago. She tried to wait up for you, but she was exhausted." Helen's eyes narrowed with motherly concern. "What happened? Can we talk after I check on her?" Helen nodded, stepping aside to let Thalia enter. The house smelled like home, spaghetti sauce, the lavender air freshener Helen preferred, and the faint scent of Ivy's strawberry shampoo. Normal smells from a normal life that suddenly felt precious and fragile. Thalia climbed the stairs to Ivy's room, each step creaking in the familiar pattern she'd memorized over 3 years of living here. She pushed open the door slowly, letting light from the hallway spill across the pink and white bedroom that Ivy had decorated with drawings of horses and Marines in uniform. Her daughter lay curled on her side, one hand tucked under her pillow, breathing with the deep rhythm of childhood sleep. Her blonde hair, so much like her father's, spread across the pillow. 8 years old, 3rd grade. A girl who wanted to be a Marine, just like her mom and her late father, who talked about serving her country with the absolute certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned that the world could take everything from you in an instant. Talia knelt beside the bed, brushing a strand of hair from Ivy's face. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." For what? For the mistake in the mess hall? For potentially losing the career that gave them stability, health care, a future? For being human and flawed and capable of thoughtless cruelty when exhausted and stressed? All of it. None of it. Everything. She kissed Ivy's forehead and left the room, pulling the door closed with a quiet click. Downstairs, Helen had made tea, her solution to every crisis, big or small. 2 mugs sat on the kitchen table, steam rising in gentle spirals. Helen sat in her usual chair, her face composed but her hands betraying her anxiety, fingers drumming against the ceramic mug. Thalia sat down and told her everything. The 18 hours of training, the desperate sprint to the mess hall, the man blocking her path, the push, the terrible silence that followed, the realization of who she'd shoved, the meeting with Colonel Hargrove, the appointment tomorrow morning that could end her career. Helen listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something that looked like grief. When Thalia finished, silence filled the kitchen like a physical presence, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a neighbor's dog barking. "Knox Ashford," Helen said finally, her voice strange. "Did you say Knox Ashford?" "Yes, Sergeant Major Knox Ashford. Why?" Helen stood up abruptly, walked to a drawer, and pulled out a folder that Thalia had never seen before. She opened it on the table, revealing bank statements, deposit slips, letters spanning decades. After your father died in 1991, Helen began, her voice thick with emotion, we had nothing. The military benefits helped, but they weren't enough. I was working 2 jobs, barely keeping us afloat. She pointed to a bank statement from 1992. Then these started arriving. Anonymous deposits, $800 a month. I tried to trace them, but they came through some kind of military assistance fund that protected the donor's identity. Helen pulled out more documents. They continued for 15 years, nearly $150,000 total. When you went to college, there was a scholarship, Marine Legacy Fund, $40,000. When your husband died in Afghanistan, there was an insurance payout that seemed larger than it should have been. $50,000 listed as a survivor benefit enhancement. Talia stared at the documents, her mind struggling to process what her mother was showing her. 2 years ago, I finally hired someone to investigate where all this money came from, Helen continued. It took months, but they traced it back to a single source. She looked at her daughter with tears in her eyes. Sergeant Major Knox Ashford has given our family over $200,000 across 33 years. Money he earned and then gave away, anonymously, because he made a promise to your father. The room seemed to tilt sideways. Thalia gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. What promise? I don't know the details, but your father and Knox Ashford served together in Desert Storm. They were in the same unit, the same platoon. When your father died, Ashford was there. He was one of the Marines who carried the body back. Helen's voice broke. And apparently at some point, he promised your father something, promised to take care of us. And he's kept that promise for 33 years, without ever once asking for recognition or thanks. Thalia felt like she might be sick. She'd shoved the man who'd supported her family for her entire life. The man who'd paid for her education, helped them survive her father's death, supported them through her husband's death. The man who'd done all of this silently, anonymously, asking nothing in return. I pushed him, Mom, Talia whispered. I pushed him like he was nothing. Helen reached across the table and gripped her daughter's hands. Then tomorrow, you show him who you really are. Not the exhausted captain who made a terrible mistake, but the Marine your father would have been proud of. The officer who stays late to help struggling Marines. The mother who fights through deployments and loss and keeps going. That's who you are, Thalia. But Thalia wasn't sure anymore. The mess hall incident had revealed something ugly, a tendency to devalue people based on perceived status, to treat others as obstacles when they stood between her and what she wanted. That flaw existed in her. Sergeant Major Ashford had simply been the unlucky person who revealed it. After Helen went upstairs to bed, Thalia sat alone in the living room with her laptop, unable to sleep, unable to stop her mind from racing. She pulled up everything she could find about Knox Ashford, official Marine Corps biographies, news articles, military forums where Marines who'd served under him shared stories. The picture that emerged was complex and humbling. He was tough, absolutely demanding of excellence, intolerant of disrespect or incompetence. 3 officers and 2 senior NCOs had seen their careers end under his oversight for various offenses ranging from harassment to abuse of authority. He didn't suffer fools, didn't make excuses for failure, and held everyone, including himself, to the highest possible standard. But there were other stories too. A lance corporal caught stealing from the PX, normally a career-ending offense, whom Ashford had personally mentored for 6 months, helping him address the financial desperation that had driven him to theft. The Marine was now a staff sergeant with an exemplary record, a lieutenant who'd frozen during a firefight, nearly getting his platoon killed, whom Ashford had counseled through his PTSD and helped return to effective service. The common thread in the second chance stories was genuine remorse and willingness to change. Ashford seemed to have an ability to distinguish between Marines who made mistakes but had good hearts, and those who were fundamentally unsuited for service. Which category did Talia fall into? At 0200 hours, she gave up on sleep entirely and went to her home office. She pulled out a notepad and began writing. If tomorrow was the end of her career, she wanted to leave with dignity. She drafted what might be her final report as a Marine officer, choosing each word carefully. She updated her resume for the first time in years, trying to translate military skills into civilian terms. Leadership became team management and personnel development. Tactical planning became strategic resource allocation and risk assessment. The exercise felt hollow, like translating poetry into a language that couldn't capture the original meaning. But she also wrote something else, a letter to Sergeant Major Ashford that she might never send. In it, she poured out her genuine remorse, her recognition of what her action revealed about her character in that moment, and her commitment to being better. Writing it helped clarify her thoughts, helped her understand what she needed to say tomorrow when she faced the man whose judgment would determine her future. At 03:45 hours, Helen appeared in the doorway in her bathrobe. "Come to bed, Talia, even if it's just for an hour." Talia followed her mother upstairs and lay in the darkness, listening to the house settle around her. The refrigerator humming downstairs, the wind moving through the trees outside her window, the distant sound of reveille that would play across the base in a few hours, calling Marines to another day of service. She might never hear that sound as a Marine again. Tomorrow at 0530, she would face Sergeant Major Knox Ashford and learn whether her career survived the worst mistake she'd ever made. Her alarm went off at 0445 hours. Thalia had maybe gotten 20 minutes of actual sleep, her mind too active, too full of scenarios and fears to truly rest. She showered, shaved her legs with extra care despite the exhaustion, and put on her most immaculate uniform. Every detail was perfect. Boots shined to a mirror finish, brass gleaming, not a single thread out of place. If she was going to face judgment, she'd do it looking like a Marine. Helen made breakfast, but Thalia could barely eat. Toast sat like cardboard in her mouth. Coffee tasted like ash. Her mother packed her a lunch anyway, the same routine they'd followed for 12 years, as if maintaining normalcy could somehow protect them from what was coming. At the door, Helen hugged her tightly. "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you," she whispered. "Come home to us." "Always," Thalia promised, though the word felt hollow. The drive back to Camp Pendleton felt surreal in the pre-dawn darkness. The base was just waking up, Marines gathering for PT and formation, street lights still on, the day shift beginning their routines. Thalia parked outside Building 4, where Sergeant Major Ashford had set up his temporary office. She was 30 minutes early, but she needed the time to compose herself, to gather whatever strength she had left. She sat on a bench outside the building, watching the sky gradually lighten from black to deep blue to the pale gray of approaching dawn. Other Marines passed, heading to their duty stations. A few recognized her and nodded greetings. Did they know? Had word spread about what she'd done? Camp Pendleton's rumor mill was incredibly efficient. By now, probably every Marine on base knew that Captain Mercer had shoved the new Sergeant Major. At 0520 hours, Thalia entered the building. It was older, one of the original structures from when the base was first established in 1942. The hallways smelled like floor wax and old paint, institutional smells that were somehow comforting in their familiarity. Her boots echoed on the tile floor as she climbed the stairs to the second floor, each step carrying her closer to a future she couldn't predict. Room 203 was at the end of the hall. The door was closed, but light showed underneath, and she could hear movement inside. He was already there, probably had been for hours. Men like Knox Ashford didn't need much sleep. They were fueled by something stronger than rest. Thalia checked her watch. 0525 hours. She could wait 5 more minutes, arrive exactly on time, maintain that small piece of control. But what was the point of pretending she had control over this situation? The Sergeant Major held all the cards. Her fate was entirely in his hands. She approached the door and knocked firmly, 3 sharp raps that announced her presence without hesitation. "Enter," came a voice from inside. Calm, controlled. The same voice that had probably given orders under fire in Fallujah in the mountains of Afghanistan. Talia opened the door and stepped into the room that would determine her future. The office was sparse in a way that suggested either temporary occupation or deliberate minimalism. A metal desk that had probably served a dozen different officers over the decades. 2 chairs, one behind the desk, one facing it. A filing cabinet pushed against the wall. An American flag in the corner, its colors vibrant against the institutional beige walls. No personal photographs, no awards displayed. Nothing to indicate this was the workspace of one of the Marine Corps' most decorated enlisted leaders. Through the single window, Thalia could see the sun just beginning to crest the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a morning that might mark the end of everything she'd worked for. Sergeant Major Knox Ashford sat behind the desk, and this time there was no mistaking his rank. He wore his Marine Corps Combat Utility uniform, the MCCUU, in the woodland Marpat camouflage pattern. On his collar sat the insignia of his rank, the 3 chevrons up and 4 rockers down, with the star in the center that marked him as an E9, the pinnacle of the enlisted structure. On his chest, above the left pocket, his name tape read Ashford in bold letters. Above the right pocket, a simple U.S. Marines. But it was his face that commanded attention. Those ice blue eyes that had seen 3 decades of warfare looked at her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see every thought, every fear, every rationalization racing through her mind. His face was weathered in the way that combat veterans' faces often were, not just aged by time, but marked by stress and responsibility and the weight of decisions that determine whether people lived or died. "Captain Mercer," he said, his voice carrying a slight rasp that might have come from decades of shouting orders over gunfire and explosions. "You're early. Close the door and have a seat." Talia did as ordered, her movements mechanical, drilled into her by years of military discipline. She sat in the chair across from him, maintaining perfect posture despite every instinct screaming at her to stand at attention, to show deference, to somehow physically demonstrate the respect she'd failed to show 24 hours ago. Ashford closed a folder on his desk, her personnel file, she realized, and folded his hands on top of it. The silence stretched between them like a wire pulled taut, ready to snap. Through the window, she could hear the morning sounds of the base coming to life. Vehicles starting, boots on pavement, the distant cadence call of a drill instructor leading a formation. Finally, Ashford spoke. 33 years ago, I was 25 years old, standing in the Kuwaiti desert with 2nd Marine Division. It was January 1991, and we were preparing for what would become Desert Storm. His voice was measured, almost conversational, but there was an undercurrent of emotion that suggested he was reliving the memory as he spoke. I was a corporal then, young, thought I knew everything, scared out of my mind but too proud to show it. We'd been in the desert for months, training, waiting, wondering if the air campaign would be enough or if we'd have to go in on the ground. Talia remained silent, uncertain where this was going, afraid that interrupting would shatter whatever moment was unfolding. There was a gunnery sergeant in my platoon, Garrett Mercer, your father. Ashford's eyes locked onto hers. We called him the Guardian because he seemed to have a sixth sense for danger. He'd been a scout sniper before moving to platoon leadership, and he still had the reflexes, the awareness. Saved our lives more times than I could count during training. Thalia felt her breath catch. Her father who had died when she was barely old enough to remember him, whose face she knew only from photographs, whose voice she couldn't recall no matter how hard she tried. When the ground war started, Ashford continued, it was chaos. They told us it would be a clean sweep, that the Iraqi forces would fold quickly, and for the most part, They did. But there were pockets of resistance. Republican Guard units that decided to make a stand, and we walked right into one of them. He paused, and Thalia saw something flicker across his face, pain that 33 years hadn't fully erased. We were pinned down, 11 of us in a position that should have held 4. Enemy fire from 3 directions. I was out of ammunition, bleeding from shrapnel wounds I didn't even know I had yet. I remember thinking this was it. This was how it ended. 25 years old, dead in a desert halfway around the world from everyone I loved. Ashford's voice dropped lower, taking on a quality that made the hair on Thalia's arm stand up. And then your father appeared. I don't know where he'd been or how he got to us, but suddenly he was there with his M40 rifle, and he started shooting. 11 rounds. 11 Iraqi soldiers who had us dead to rights. 11 perfect shots, each one creating an opening, a gap in their fire that let us move, let us escape. He saved all of you, Thalia said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. He saved my life, Ashford corrected. Specifically, personally, saved my life. And as we were pulling back to regroup, he put his hand on my shoulder and said something I've never forgotten. He said, Knox, a warrior isn't defined by who he can defeat. He's defined by who he chooses to protect. Remember that. Respect everyone because you never know who will need your protection tomorrow. Ashford opened a drawer and pulled out a photograph. Black and white, grainy with age, 2 Marines in desert camouflage uniforms, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the kind of brotherhood that only forms in combat. One was clearly a younger version of the man sitting across from her. The other, Thalia felt tears spring to her eyes, was her father. 3 days after he said that, Ashford continued, we encountered an Iraqi translator who'd been helping coalition forces. Saddam's intelligence services had marked him for execution. He was running, terrified, and most of our unit wanted to keep moving, to avoid getting tangled up in what looked like a local problem. He turned the photograph so Thalia could see it better. Your father refused. He said that translator was a human being who deserved protection, regardless of whether protecting him advanced our mission or put us at risk. He created a defensive position, held off the Iraqi forces pursuing the translator, and got the man to safety. Ashford's voice grew rough. A mortar hit his position. He used his own body to shield the translator from the blast. The translator survived. Your father didn't. Thalia couldn't stop the tears now. They ran down her face, hot and bitter, as she stared at the photograph of a man she'd never really known, but whose absence had shaped her entire life. The last thing Garrett said to me was 3 days before he died. He made me promise something. Ashford looked directly at Thalia. He said, Knox, if anything happens to me, take care of Rebecca and Thalia. Make sure my girls are okay. I promised him I would, and for 33 years I've kept that promise. The anonymous deposits, the scholarship, the insurance payment, all of it clicked into place like pieces of a puzzle Thalia had never known existed. I followed your career from a distance, Ashford said. When you enlisted at 18, I was proud. When you made it through boot camp, through scout sniper school, through your first deployment, every step I watched and thought, Garrett would be proud. When you earned your Bronze Star in Afghanistan, when you showed the kind of leadership and courage that defines the best of our Corps, I knew his legacy lived on in you. He leaned forward slightly, his ice blue eyes never leaving hers. But last night in that mess hall, you forgot the most important lesson your father tried to teach. The lesson he taught me that I've spent 33 years trying to live by. I treated you like you didn't matter, Thalia said, her voice breaking. I saw someone I thought was beneath me, and I acted like their dignity was less important than my convenience. Yes, Ashford said simply, you did. The silence that followed was crushing. Thalia wanted to defend herself, to explain, to somehow make it better, but there was nothing to say. The truth was the truth, stark and undeniable. Ashford reached into another drawer and pulled out 2 documents, setting them side by side on the desk. I'm going to give you a choice, Captain Mercer, the same kind of choice your father gave me when he taught me that everyone matters. He tapped the first document. Option 1, a formal letter of reprimand for conduct unbecoming an officer. It goes into your permanent file. It will follow you for the rest of your career, affecting every promotion board, every assignment selection, every opportunity for advancement. You'll be able to continue serving, and if you work hard enough, you might eventually overcome its impact. But it will always be there, a mark on your record that can never be fully erased. Talia looked at the document and saw her future written there, a career ceiling that would prevent her from ever rising above her current rank. Opportunities closed off. The trust and respect she'd earned over 12 years permanently diminished. Option 2, Ashford continued, sliding the second document forward. Something I've designed specifically for you. I call it the Legacy Restoration Initiative. Talia picked up the document and began reading. With each paragraph, her eyes widened. For 30 consecutive days, Ashford explained as she read, you will report to the reception center at 0500 hours prior to your regular duty assignment. You will personally greet every incoming Marine, officer, enlisted, or civilian employee arriving at Camp Pendleton, regardless of rank or position. You will ensure that each new arrival experiences dignified, respectful treatment during their in-processing. He pointed to the next section. During this same period, you will maintain your full responsibilities as a scout sniper instructor. Your training schedule doesn't change. Your duties don't change. This is in addition to, not in place of, your current workload. Talia did the math quickly. 5 a.m. to 8 a.m. at the reception center, 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. with her training platoon. That left evenings for the next requirement, which she was now reading. You will develop a comprehensive training module on respect, dignity, and professional military bearing for implementation across all NCO professional development courses at Camp Pendleton. This module will include practical scenarios, case studies, and assessment tools. The completed curriculum will be submitted for review within 45 days. She looked up at Ashford, trying to process what he was asking. Essentially full-time jobs for a month, while developing a major training program. She'd be surviving on maybe 4 hours of sleep per night. It would be brutal, exhausting, potentially impossible. But it was also an opportunity. The final requirement, Ashford said, pointing to the last paragraph, on day 30, you will present your completed curriculum to the base command team. 200 senior Marines, including colonels, sergeant majors, and the commanding general. You will defend its merits, demonstrate its value, and convince them it's worth implementing. If you fail, if you don't complete the program, if you don't produce quality work, or if the command team rejects your curriculum, you will face administrative separation from the Marine Corps. The stakes couldn't be clearer. This wasn't just punishment or remediation. This was a test with only 2 outcomes: complete success or career-ending failure. This isn't punishment, Captain Mercer, Ashford said, his voice firm but not unkind. This is investment. I'm investing my time, my reputation, and the resources of this installation in the belief that you can become the leader I see potential for in your record. The leader your father would be proud of. He stood and walked around the desk, leaning against it with his arms crossed. The posture was less formal, almost conversational, though his intensity never wavered. I've ended careers for less than what you did yesterday, he continued. I've recommended courts-martial for Marines who abused their authority, who treated others with contempt, who violated the trust placed in them by their rank. But I've also learned to recognize the difference between someone who is fundamentally unsuited for service and someone who made a terrible mistake but has the capacity to grow from it. Which one do you think I am, Sergeant Major? Talia asked quietly. I think you're at a crossroads, Ashford replied. Yesterday you revealed a character flaw, the tendency to devalue people you perceive as beneath you. That flaw exists in you, Captain. We both know it now. The question isn't whether it exists. The question is whether you're willing to do the hard, exhausting work required to eliminate it. He picked up her personnel file and flipped through it. Private Morrison, the Marine you helped with repelling yesterday. I spoke with him this morning at 0430. Do you know what he told me? Thalia shook her head. He said you stayed with him for 3 hours past the end of training. He said you talked him through his fear, never once made him feel weak or inadequate, never showed impatience or frustration. He said you made him believe he could overcome something he thought was impossible. Ashford looked up from the file. That's the leader you're capable of being. He set the file down. But that same day, you pushed someone you thought was a civilian because they were in your way. That's also who you're capable of being. This assignment is designed to help you become the first version permanently and eliminate the second version entirely. Thalia looked down at the Legacy Restoration Initiative document again, seeing it now not as punishment, but as exactly what Ashford called it, investment. He was betting on her potential, the same way her father had apparently bet on him 33 years ago. The reception center assignment serves multiple purposes, Ashford explained, beginning to pace slowly. First, it puts you in a position where you must treat every person with respect, regardless of rank. You won't know if the private walking through that door is someone who will save lives in combat someday, or someone whose family sacrificed everything for them to serve. You'll learn to see the human being, not just the rank insignia. Second, you'll mentor the NCOs who work in reception. You'll teach them what you're learning. There's no better way to internalize a lesson than to teach it to others. You'll transform not just yourself, but the culture of that entire section. He stopped pacing and turned to face her. Third, the curriculum you develop will become part of Camp Pendleton's NCO education program. If it's good, if you pour yourself into creating something genuinely valuable, it will affect thousands of Marines over time. Your mistake yesterday will ultimately improve this entire installation's culture, but only if you're willing to do the work. Thalia felt the weight of it settling over her shoulders. This wasn't just about saving her career. It was about transforming her failure into something that could benefit the entire base, about turning the worst moment of her professional life into a legacy that honored her father's memory. The letter of reprimand is the easy path, Ashford said, his voice taking on an almost gentle quality. You take the hit to your record, serve out your career under a cloud, and eventually retire with benefits intact. No one could fault you for choosing that option. It's safe, it's predictable, it's the path of least resistance. He leaned forward slightly. But the Legacy Restoration Initiative, that's the hard path. It will push you to your absolute limits. You'll question whether you can do it. You'll be exhausted, frustrated, and tested every single day. Some nights you'll go home and wonder if it's worth it. His ice blue eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. But if you succeed, if you complete this program and create something meaningful, you won't just save your career, Captain Mercer. You'll transform it. You'll become the kind of leader who changes Marines' lives, the kind of officer the Corps desperately needs, the kind of Marine your father was. The room fell silent except for the sound of the base waking up outside. Through the window, Thalia could see formations marching, vehicles moving, the daily rhythm of military life continuing as it had for decades. Thousands of Marines going about their duties, most of them never knowing this conversation was happening. But what she decided in this moment would affect many of them. I need to ask you something, Sergeant Major, Thalia said carefully. Why are you offering me this chance? You could end my career with a single signature. After what I did, after I disrespected you in front of 100 Marines, why invest this much effort in one captain who showed you such contempt? Ashford was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of decades of memory. Because your father invested in me when he didn't have to. Because he taught me that great leaders aren't born. They're forged through adversity and given opportunities to be better than their worst moments. Because someone believed I was worth saving despite my failures, and that belief changed my entire life. He paused, then added quietly, and because when I read your file, when I talked to your Marines, when I saw the genuine shame and remorse in your eyes just now, I saw someone worth investing in. I could be wrong. You could fail this program and prove that yesterday was who you really are. But I don't think I'm wrong. Talia felt emotion rising in her chest, gratitude, determination, fear, and something like hope all tangled together. I won't let you down, Sergeant Major. Don't make me promises, Captain, Ashford said sharply. Make me results. Show me through your actions, not your words, that you're the leader you claim you want to be. He slid both documents across the desk. The letter of reprimand on the left, the Legacy Restoration Initiative on the right. Choose now. I need your decision before you leave this office. Thalia looked at both documents. Her hand hovered over the reprimand for just a moment. The safe choice, the path of least resistance, the option that would let her continue serving without the crushing weight of impossible expectations. Then she picked up the Legacy Restoration Initiative and pulled a pen from her pocket. Her hand was steady as she signed her name at the bottom of the document, committing herself to 30 days that would either destroy her or remake her. I choose to be better, Sergeant Major, she said, meeting his eyes. I choose to honor my father's memory and your investment in me. Ashford took the signed paper and countersigned it with his own pen, his signature as precise and controlled as everything else about him. Report to the reception center at 0500 tomorrow morning. Master Sergeant Webb runs that section. I've already briefed him on your assignment. He's expecting you. Yes, Sergeant Major. And Captain Mercer. His voice stopped her as she stood to leave. This program isn't designed to be easy. It's designed to change you fundamentally. Embrace the difficulty. That's where the growth happens. I understand, Sergeant Major. I hope you do, Ashford said, and there was something in his voice, concern, perhaps, or the kind of investment a mentor makes in a student he truly believes in. Because starting tomorrow, I'm not just your senior enlisted advisor. I'm your mentor. And I don't accept failure from the Marines I invest in. Dismissed. Thalia saluted sharply, executed a perfect about-face, and walked out of the office. Her career hadn't ended. Instead, it had been given a second chance, and she was determined not to waste it. Day 1 through day 15, the crucible begins. The alarm at 0345 became Thalia's new reality. That mechanical scream in the darkness, shattering whatever fragile sleep she'd managed to claim. On day 1, she'd rolled out of bed with determination burning in her chest. By day 5, that determination had been tempered by exhaustion. By day 10, she was moving on pure discipline, her body protesting every movement. Master Sergeant Harlan Webb had been waiting for her that first morning at the reception center, his 62-year-old face carved with the kind of skepticism that came from seeing too many rehabilitation programs fail. He'd served with Ashford in Fallujah, carried shrapnel in his left leg from an IED that should have killed him, and run the reception center with mechanical efficiency for 8 years. Another officer who needs fixing, Webb had muttered that first morning, loud enough for Talia to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Let's see how long this one lasts. The first arrivals had come at 0520 that morning. 3 privates, fresh from Marine combat training, their faces showing that peculiar mixture of terror and excitement that marked every Marine's arrival at their first duty station. Private First Class Sarah Hendricks from Iowa, 19 years old, clutching her orders like a lifeline. Thalia had approached her with a smile that felt forced after 4 hours of sleep. Private Hendricks, welcome to Camp Pendleton. I'm Captain Mercer. We're glad you're here. The girl's shoulders had dropped 2 inches, tension releasing like a held breath. Thank you, ma'am. I was worried about, well, everything. That's completely normal, Thalia had said and meant it. Everyone feels that a new duty station. But you're going to do great here. Tell me about your MOS. What brought you to the Marines? As they'd talked, really talked, not just processed paperwork, Thalia had felt something shift. This wasn't performance or rehabilitation. This was connection. This mattered. By 0800, she'd welcomed 19 arrivals. By the end of week 1, she'd greeted 87 Marines, and Master Sergeant Webb had stopped muttering under his breath. But the days were brutal in ways Thalia hadn't anticipated. The reception center consumed her mornings with an intensity that left no room for the autopilot she'd relied on for 12 years of military service. Every arrival was a test. Could she see them as individuals, not just faces in a processing line? Could she maintain genuine warmth when running on 3 hours of sleep? At 0800, she'd drive across base to the Scout Sniper Training Compound, change into her field uniform, and become Captain Mercer, the instructor. 30 officer candidates who'd volunteered for one of the Marine Corps' most demanding programs. Men and women who measured their worth in precision, in the ability to put rounds on target at distances that seemed impossible. Lieutenant Dalton Blackwell had been the worst of them. 27 years old, Naval Academy graduate, ego the size of a carrier battle group. On day 3, he'd made a comment loud enough for the entire formation to hear. Guess they'll let anyone be an instructor these days, even captains who can't hack regular duty hours. The old Thalia would have crushed him, would have used her rank, her experience, her authority to make him regret every word. The new Thalia, the one running on fumes and determination, had simply looked at him and said, "Lieutenant, after class today, you and I are going to have a conversation about what leadership actually means. Be ready." That conversation had lasted 2 hours. Not a reprimand, not a dressing down. A genuine discussion about why he joined the Marines, what he hoped to accomplish, what kind of leader he wanted to become. By the end, Blackwell's swagger had cracked just enough to reveal the insecurity underneath, the fear that he wasn't good enough, that he'd never measure up to the standards he'd set for himself. "Sir," he'd said quietly as they'd finished, "I apologize for the comment this morning. It was out of line." It was, Thalia had agreed. But more importantly, it revealed something about how you see leadership, as a weapon to prove superiority instead of a tool to build others up. That's going to limit you, Lieutenant. Excellence without humility is just arrogance in a uniform. The words had come from somewhere deep, from lessons she was learning in real time at the reception center. From the way Master Sergeant Webb had started watching her greet arrivals with something approaching respect. From the realization that every interaction was either building someone up or tearing them down, and there was no neutral ground. By 1800 hours each day, Thalia would drag herself home, spend precisely 1 hour with Ivy, helping with homework, hearing about third-grade drama, being present in the only way exhaustion allowed, and then retreat to her home office to work on the curriculum. Dignity through excellence was supposed to be a training module, but as Thalia developed it, she realized it was becoming something more personal, a framework for the kind of leader she wanted to be. Module 1 covered the psychology of respect, how the brain processed dignity and disrespect, why small interactions mattered, the neuroscience behind trust formation. Module 2 became a collection of real scenarios. The mess hall incident, yes, but also stories from Webb's 30 years of service. Module 3 was assessment tools, ways for NCOs to evaluate their own leadership, to identify when they were treating people as obstacles instead of individuals deserving respect. Module 4 became the heart of the program, mentoring techniques, how to teach these lessons to others, how to transform unit culture one interaction at a time. But the work was crushing. By midnight each night, Thalia's eyes would blur from staring at research papers and case studies. By 100, she'd force herself to sleep, knowing the alarm would scream in less than 3 hours. Helen carried the family through those weeks. Meals appeared. Laundry got done. Ivy's needs were met by a grandmother who understood sacrifice in ways only a Marine's widow could. But Thalia saw the worry in her mother's eyes, the concern that her daughter was burning herself out for a program that might fail anyway. On day 12, Thalia had fallen asleep at her desk, waking at 0400 with her face pressed against Module 3's draft, drool staining the assessment rubric she'd spent 4 hours developing. She'd had exactly 45 minutes before she needed to leave for the reception center, and the realization of how close she'd come to missing it had left her shaking. Day 16, the breaking point. It happened at 22:47 hours on a Tuesday night, 16 days into the program. In those 20 hours, she'd welcomed 12 arrivals at the reception center, run an 8-hour scout sniper field exercise in 95-degree heat, attended a mandatory all-hands meeting about updated safety protocols, and worked on the curriculum for 4 hours. Ivy had cried at dinner because Mommy wasn't coming to her school play Friday. Helen had tried to comfort her, but the look she'd given Thalia had carried more weight than words. Concern, disappointment, fear that her daughter was sacrificing too much. And now the curriculum refused to cooperate. The words swam on the screen. The research she'd read yesterday had evaporated from her memory. The framework that had seemed brilliant 2 days ago now felt shallow and derivative. Thalia picked up her phone and called Ashford. It was nearly 11 p.m., but the sergeant major had told her to contact him if she needed anything. This qualified. "Mercer," Ashford answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. "What's wrong?" "Sergeant Major, I can't do this." The words came out broken, barely above a whisper. "I'm failing my daughter. I haven't slept more than 3 hours a night in 2 weeks. The curriculum isn't coming together the way it should. I'm going to fail the presentation, and I'm going to lose everything anyway, so what's the point?" Silence on the other end. Long enough that Thalia wondered if she'd made a catastrophic mistake, if admitting weakness to her mentor was the final error that would end this. Then, "I'll be there in 20 minutes. Put coffee on." Ashford arrived at 2318 hours, still in his utilities, carrying a worn leather portfolio that looked like it had survived multiple deployments. Helen let him in with a look of profound relief. Finally, someone who could help her daughter before she collapsed entirely. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Helen had revealed Ashford's 33 years of anonymous support. The same table where Thalia had eaten thousands of family meals. Now it became a war room. "Talk to me," Ashford said simply. "Everything." Thalia talked about the exhaustion that had become her baseline, about missing Ivy's moments, about the curriculum that felt inadequate, about the fear that she was failing at everything, the program, motherhood, leadership, all of it. Ashford listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his ice-blue eyes steady on hers. "Your father called me one night in January 1991, he said finally, 2 days before the ground war started. It was 0200, and he was supposed to be sleeping before what we knew would be the fight of our lives. Instead, he was awake, terrified." Thalia straightened slightly. Her father? Terrified? The man in the photographs had always looked invincible. "He told me he wanted to quit," Ashford continued. "Told me the weight of being responsible for his Marines' lives was crushing him. He was 28 years old, married with a baby daughter he'd barely seen, and he was looking at leading 40 men into combat against an enemy we didn't fully understand." Ashford pulled a folded piece of paper from his portfolio. Yellow with age, creased from decades of being carried. "He wrote this that night, never sent it. I found it in his gear after he died. With your mother's permission, I've kept it all these years." He handed the paper to Thalia. Her father's handwriting, angular and precise. "Dear Rebecca and Thalia, if you're reading this, I didn't make it back. Know that I loved you both more than I knew how to express. Know that every choice I made was trying to be worthy of you. Tonight I'm scared. Tomorrow we go into combat, and I don't know if I'm strong enough, smart enough, good enough to keep my Marines alive. The weight of it is crushing me. But Knox reminded me tonight, I'm not doing this for myself. I'm doing it for the Marines I'll protect tomorrow, for the families they'll return to, for the lives they'll live because someone chose to stand between them and danger. That's worth being scared. That's worth the crushing weight. That's worth everything. If I don't come back, take care of each other. And remember, we serve something larger than ourselves. That's where we find the strength to do impossible things. Love always, Garrett. Thalia couldn't read the last paragraph through her tears. Ashford's hand on her shoulder was steady, grounding. Your father found the strength to lead his Marines the next day, Ashford said quietly. Not because he stopped being scared, not because the weight got lighter, but because he remembered why he was carrying it. He pulled the curriculum drafts from Thalia's portfolio, spreading them across the table. You're not doing this to prove something to the command team, Captain. You're doing it to honor your father's memory, to help ensure other Marines don't make the mistakes you did, to transform your failure into something that helps thousands of people. Ashford started reorganizing the modules, pointing out connections Thalia's exhausted brain had missed. Module 1's neuroscience connected to Module 4's mentoring techniques. Module 2's scenarios could be reordered to build narrative momentum. Module 3's assessment tools needed to be simplified, made more practical. By 0200, they'd rebuilt the curriculum framework into something that actually worked. By 0300, Thalia felt hope for the first time in days. You're going to make it, Captain, Ashford said as he prepared to leave. Not because it's easy, but because your father's daughter doesn't quit when things get hard. He paused at the door. And Thalia, go to your daughter's play Friday. Ivy needs her mother more than the curriculum needs another late night. Excellence includes knowing what you're excellent for. Family matters too. After he left, Thalia sat alone in the quiet kitchen, holding her father's letter like a talisman. The exhaustion was still there. The work was still impossible. But she had a reason to carry it now that went beyond saving her career. She was doing this for every Marine who'd walk into a reception center and deserved to be treated with dignity. For every NCO who needed to learn that respect wasn't weakness. For her father's memory and the lesson he died teaching. That was worth the crushing weight. Day 22, the accident. The accident happened at 13:47 hours during a long-range shooting exercise. Thalia had been drilling her scout sniper candidates on windage calculations for ranges beyond 1,200 meters. The distance where margin of error became the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Lieutenant Blackwell was on the line, working a 1,400-meter shot. He'd been improving over the past 3 weeks, his ego slowly giving way to genuine competence. But improvement wasn't the same as mastery, and the wind at Camp Pendleton's range could shift faster than inexperienced shooters could compensate. Corporal Marcus Kellen, 21 years old from Tennessee, was downrange marking targets. He wore the bright orange vest that should have made him visible to everyone. Should have been safe behind the berm designed to catch wayward rounds. But Blackwell had miscalculated the crosswind by 3 miles per hour. At 1,400 meters, that error translated to nearly 6 feet of drift. The training round, rubber, not live ammunition, but still capable of serious injury at velocity, sailed wide of the target. Thalia saw it in slow motion. The vapor trail tracking wrong, Kellen stepping out from behind the berm at exactly the wrong moment. The round closing distance at 2,700 feet per second. She didn't think. 12 years of training and 3 deployments worth of muscle memory took over. She was moving before her conscious mind registered the danger, sprinting downrange with speed that shouldn't have been possible after 22 days of 4-hour sleep nights. 20 feet, 15, 10. She hit Kellen with a tackle that would have made a linebacker proud, driving him sideways as the round cracked past where his head had been 1 second earlier. They went down in a tangle, Kellen protected beneath her, and Thalia felt the impact against her left shoulder like being hit with a baseball bat swung by someone who meant it. The pain was instant and overwhelming. The training round struck the muscle of her shoulder with enough force to tear tissue, break blood vessels, raise a hematoma the size of a baseball. Thalia gasped, vision going gray at the edges. "Korsman!" someone was shouting. Multiple voices, overlapping. "Korsman up!" Thalia pushed herself up, breath coming in short gasps. Her left arm hung useless, already swelling. Blood was seeping through her uniform, not from the impact site, but from where she'd scraped her forearm against the rough ground. Blackwell was running toward her, his face the color of old newspaper. "Ma'am, I'm sorry, I miscalculated. I didn't see—" "Kellen," Thalia managed through teeth gritted against the pain. "Is Kellen okay?" "I'm fine, ma'am," the corporal said from where he was sitting up, shaken but unharmed. "You saved my— Ma'am, you're bleeding." The corpsman arrived, a Navy petty officer who took one look at Thalia's shoulder and immediately called for transport to the base hospital. But Thalia shook her head, using her good arm to push herself fully upright. "Not yet," she said. "We have a training evolution to complete." "Captain, you need medical attention," the corpsman protested. "In 15 minutes. Thalia's voice carried the kind of authority that came from somewhere beyond rank. "I need to finish this demonstration first." She walked back to the firing line on legs that wanted to shake, but wouldn't. Her left arm was useless, but her right was still functional. The candidates stood frozen, watching her with expressions ranging from shock to something approaching awe. "Lieutenant Blackwell," Thalia said, her voice steady despite the pain radiating from her shoulder. "What did you do wrong?" Blackwell looked like he might be sick. "Ma'am, I miscalculated the windage. I estimated 10 miles per hour crosswind, but it was 13. At 1,400 meters, that's 6 feet of drift," Thalia finished, "which would have killed Corporal Kellen if he'd been enemy personnel, or gotten him killed if he'd been one of your Marines in a combat situation." She paused, letting that sink in. "This is why we train. This is why we drill fundamentals until they're automatic. Because in combat, there are no training rounds. There are only rounds that find their targets or rounds that miss. And misses get people killed." She picked up the M40 rifle with her good hand, awkwardly but with the kind of familiarity that came from thousands of hours of practice. "Specialist Rivera, give me a windage reading." Rivera, a sharp-eyed female Marine from California, studied the mirage through her spotting scope. 13 miles per hour, ma'am. Gusting to 15. Variable crosswind from right to left. Elevation? 1,400 meters, ma'am. 23 degrees ambient temperature. Barometric pressure, 30.1. Thalia did the calculations in her head. Wind drift at 13 miles per hour for 1,400 meters with 308 Winchester ammunition, accounting for the Coriolis effect at this latitude, spin drift from the right-hand rifling twist. Temperature and pressure affecting air density, all of it processed in the 3 seconds it took her to adjust the scope's windage and elevation knobs with her one functional hand. She settled into the prone position, which sent fresh waves of pain through her injured shoulder. Ignored it. Controller her breathing despite the way each inhale felt like someone was pressing a hot iron against her deltoid. Focused on the target downrange through the scope. The fundamentals were still there. They'd always been there. Natural point of aim, breath control, trigger press so smooth it surprised even her when the round broke. The crack of the rifle. The familiar recoil against her good shoulder. 3 seconds of silence as the round flew downrange. "Hit," Rivera called out. "Center mass." Thalia stood up slowly, using the rifle for support, and looked at her candidates. All of them, even Blackwell, especially Blackwell, were staring at her with undisguised respect. "Fundamentals," she said simply. "When you're exhausted, when you're injured, when everything is falling apart, the fundamentals are what save you. They're what save your Marines. Drill them until they're automatic. Drill them until you can execute them in your sleep. Because someday, your life or someone else's will depend on it. She handed the rifle to Rivera. Class dismissed. Lieutenant Blackwell, you'll stay. Corman, I'm ready for that ambulance now. The emergency room physician at the Camp Pendleton Hospital told her she'd torn her deltoid muscle, raised a massive hematoma, and come within a few millimeters of fracturing her humerus. He wanted to admit her overnight for observation. Thalia refused. She had the curriculum to work on, and she'd already missed too many evenings with Ivy. The physician compromised. Heavy-duty painkillers, a sling to immobilize her arm, and strict orders not to do anything strenuous for at least a week. Define strenuous, Thalia had said, and the doctor had given her a look that suggested he knew exactly what she was planning to ignore his orders. Blackwell showed up at the hospital at 2100 hours, still in his field uniform, carrying flowers that looked like he'd bought them from the Base Exchange gift shop. "Sir, permission to speak freely?" he asked as he entered her room. "Granted, Lieutenant. I could have killed Corporal Kellen today, and you saved him by putting yourself in danger. You didn't have to do that. You could have let the round miss or hit him, and it wouldn't have been your fault. But you risked yourself to protect someone else." Thalia looked at him, this cocky Naval Academy graduate whose ego had been the size of an aircraft carrier 3 weeks ago. "Lieutenant, that's what Marines do. We protect each other. The rank on your collar doesn't change that fundamental truth." "I know that now," Blackwell said quietly. "I've been watching you these past 3 weeks. The way you greet new Marines at the reception center. Corporal Hendricks told me you spent 20 minutes talking to her about her family, made her feel like she mattered. The way you teach us, pushing hard but never making us feel worthless when we screw up. And today, taking a round meant for Kellen without even thinking about it." He set the flowers down on the bedside table. "That's what leadership looks like. Not the textbook version they taught us at the academy. The real version, the kind worth following. Sir, I want to apologize. Not just for the comment 3 weeks ago, for the attitude I brought to this program. I thought leadership was about being the best, proving I was better than everyone else. You've shown me it's about making everyone else better, about protecting the people you serve with, about dignity and respect, not dominance." Talia felt something shift in her chest. This was why the 30 days mattered, not just for her own redemption, but for the ripple effect. Blackwell had changed because she'd changed, and he'd carry that forward to every Marine he'd ever lead. "You're going to be a good officer, Lieutenant," she said, "not because you're the best shot or the smartest tactician, but because you learned humility. That's what separates good leaders from great ones." After he left, Talia sat alone in the hospital room, her shoulder throbbing despite the painkillers, and felt something close to peace. 8 days left. 8 days until the presentation that would determine whether her curriculum was worthy of implementation, whether her redemption was complete. She could do this. Her father's daughter didn't quit when things got hard. Day 30, the presentation. The auditorium fell silent as Captain Thalia Mercer stood behind the podium, her hands no longer trembling against the polished wood. 200 senior Marines filled the seats before her, colonels with decades of command, sergeant majors whose chests bore the weight of wars she'd studied in history books. The overhead lights that had felt like interrogation lamps 30 days ago now felt like stage lights, illuminating the most important presentation of her life. In the front row, Sergeant Major Knox Ashford sat with his arms crossed, his weathered face showing the slightest hint of what might have been pride. Those ice-blue eyes that had witnessed 36 years of combat were fixed on her now, not with the assessing gaze of a judge, but with the supportive presence of a mentor who'd invested everything in this moment. Talia's throat was dry, but her prepared speech, memorized and refined over 4 weeks of exhausted midnight sessions, felt like a natural extension of everything she'd learned. The PowerPoint slide behind her glowed with a single phrase: dignity through excellence. She'd lived this program, bled for it, been broken and remade by it. Now she just had to convince 200 skeptical senior leaders that it was worth spreading across the entire Marine Corps. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice strong and clear. "I'm Captain Thalia Mercer, and 30 days ago, I committed the worst mistake of my military career." The room held its breath, just as it had in that flash forward she'd experienced what felt like a lifetime ago. 30 days ago, I physically pushed a man in the mess hall because I was exhausted, hungry, and frustrated. I didn't know who he was. More importantly, I didn't care who he was. I saw someone blocking my path to food, and I treated him as an obstacle to be moved aside. His dignity, his humanity, his worth, none of that mattered to me in that moment. She paused, letting the confession land. That man was Sergeant Major Knox Ashford, the Marine you see in the front row, a Marine with 36 years of service, 3 Navy Crosses, and a record of leadership that I can only aspire to match someday. But none of those credentials are why what I did was wrong. Thalia clicked to the next slide, which showed a simple statement. Everyone matters. What I did was wrong because it would have been wrong regardless of who that man was. If he'd been a private fresh from boot camp, it would have been equally wrong. If he'd been a civilian contractor, a dependent, or anyone else, it would have been wrong. Because my behavior revealed something toxic in my character. I had learned to devalue people based on perceived status. She saw heads nodding in the audience. Not agreement with her past behavior, but recognition. These were leaders who'd seen this dynamic play out across decades of service. Sergeant Major Ashford could have ended my career that night, Thalia continued. Instead, he gave me a choice, a letter of reprimand that would follow me forever, or 30 days of the hardest work I've ever done. 30 days designed not to punish me, but to transform me. She walked them through the Legacy Restoration Initiative, the early mornings at the reception center, greeting every arrival with genuine dignity, the full days of scout sniper instruction, maintaining her regular duties, the late nights developing a curriculum that would transform personal failure into institutional improvement. This program you're evaluating today, Dignity Through Excellence, wasn't created in a vacuum. It was forged through 30 days of living these principles, through exhaustion and failure and small victories that built into transformation. She clicked through the modules, explaining the psychology, the scenarios, the assessment tools, the mentoring techniques. But she didn't just present theory, she shared results. At the reception center, arrival satisfaction scores increased 43% over 30 days. Marines are telling other Marines about their positive arrival experience. The culture of that section has been transformed because Master Sergeant Webb's team saw that treating people with dignity actually works better than treating them like line items on a processing sheet. A slide showed quotes from new arrivals, from the NCOs who'd changed their approach, from Lieutenant Blackwell, who'd written a statement about how the program had changed his understanding of leadership. But the most important result isn't measurable in satisfaction scores, Thalia said, her voice taking on a more personal quality. It's this: I'm a better leader today than I was 30 days ago. Not because I learned new techniques or memorized new regulations, but because I learned to see people, really see them, as individuals deserving respect regardless of their rank or position or ability to advance my career. She clicked to the next slide. Dignity plus respect equals trust. Trust equals mission success. This is the foundation of the program. When Marines know they'll be treated with dignity, they trust their leaders. When they trust their leaders, they'll follow them anywhere, into combat, through hardship, through the impossible situations we ask them to face. Thalia shared the story of Day 22, the training accident where she'd taken a round meant for Corporal Kellen. Not to glorify her own actions, but to illustrate a point. I didn't think before I moved to protect Corporal Kellen. It was automatic, instinctive. And later, when I asked myself why I'd reacted that way, I realized I'd spent 3 weeks learning to see every Marine as someone worth protecting. Kellen wasn't just a name on a roster or a body down range. He was a 21-year-old from Tennessee with a family who loved him and a future worth preserving. That shift in perspective, from seeing people as functions to seeing them as humans, changes how we lead at every level. She walked them through implementation plans, how the curriculum could be integrated into existing NCO professional development courses, how assessment tools could track cultural change across units, how mentoring techniques could cascade from senior leaders down through every level of the Corps. This program asks Marines to do something difficult, Talia said, approaching her conclusion. It asks us to examine our own behavior and admit when we fall short. It asks us to change habits that have been ingrained through years of service. It asks us to lead not through dominance but through dignity. She clicked to her final slide, which showed the black and white photograph of her father and Knox Ashford in the Kuwaiti desert, arms around each other's shoulders, grinning with the kind of brotherhood that only forms in combat. My father, Gunnery Sergeant Garrett Mercer, taught Sergeant Major Ashford a lesson in 1991. Warriors are defined not by who they can defeat, but by who they choose to protect. Everyone matters, especially those who can't defend themselves. Talia's voice grew thick with emotion. 3 days after he said that, my father died protecting an Iraqi translator that most of his unit wanted to leave behind. He gave his life for someone others thought didn't matter. And for 33 years, Sergeant Major Ashford has honored that lesson by treating every Marine, regardless of rank, with the dignity my father died defending. She paused, letting that sink in. This program is my attempt to honor that legacy, to transform my worst failure into something that helps other Marines avoid making the same mistakes, to ensure that the lesson my father died teaching continues to spread through our Corps, one interaction at a time. Her final slide appeared. Everyone matters. Protect accordingly. Thank you for your time and consideration. I'm happy to answer any questions. The applause started slowly, then built like a wave. First the colonels in the back rows, then the sergeant majors who'd served since before Thalia was born, then finally the entire auditorium rising to its feet. A standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Thalia stood at the podium, overwhelmed, as 200 senior Marines, leaders who'd seen every training fad and program come and go, showed their approval not through polite courtesy, but through genuine respect. When the applause finally died down, Sergeant Major Ashford stood and walked to the podium. The room fell silent instantly. 36 years ago, he began, Gunnery Sergeant Garrett Mercer saved my life in the Kuwaiti desert. He taught me that warriors are defined by who they protect, not who they defeat. That everyone matters, especially those who can't defend themselves. He looked directly at Talia. 3 days later, Garrett died protecting someone others wanted to abandon. He gave his life for a principle, that human dignity matters more than convenience or mission expediency. And for 33 years, I've tried to honor that lesson. Ashford pulled out an official-looking folder. Last week, the promotion board convened. Captain Thalia Mercer was selected below the zone, ahead of her peers, for promotion to major. The board specifically cited her legacy restoration work as evidence of exceptional leadership and potential for increased responsibility. Talia's breath caught. Major, the rank she thought was forever out of reach after her mistake. Additionally, Ashford continued, I've reviewed this curriculum with the division commander. He's approved Dignity Through Excellence for immediate implementation across 12 Marine installations over the next 6 months. Major Mercer will lead the training effort, personally instructing senior NCOs at each location. He walked over and extended his hand. Garrett Mercer promised me once that he'd have my back. He kept that promise with his life. I promised him I'd take care of his family. I've tried to keep that promise for 33 years. And now that work is complete. Because you don't need protection anymore, Major Mercer. You've become the protector, just like your father. Thalia shook his hand, tears streaming down her face, unable to speak past the emotion blocking her throat. The auditorium erupted in applause again, and this time it felt like celebration, like recognition, like the end of a journey that had nearly destroyed her, but had instead remade her into something better.